This is fun.
That was a good one.
I felt a little clunky at the beginning, but I eventually got in my groove.
You didn't seem clunky to me, buddy.
Thanks,
I felt
man.
clunky the whole way through.
I work with good people. I feel very happy about that.
I think if there's a little bit of self-selection there. Like, I think if there were bad vibes, then we just wouldn't work with each other anymore.
Yeah,
True.
that's probably true. I like how you turn that around into a positive for all of us.
Yeah, man.
Well done.
Yeah.
We got a good team. I just caught up with Charlie the other night, and like without I just called him to say hey, and then he was like, I know I got to get back on the show. I was like, not why I called Charlie. I mean, I did know that it would guilt him just hearing my voice, so secretly yes.
I miss Charlie.
But I knew I didn't need to say anything to make the tendrils. I parasitized his brain.
Ooh, that's the best kind of parasitism. Don't mean to get too excited about that.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. This is episode 292. Our theme this week is Matryoshka, mooching, and median magma. Which is a surprise to one of the co-hosts who is joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. And it's the return of Kelly.
Hello! It's been a while. How you doing, Ryan?
Doing well, but we know that Kelly hates coming up with themes, so I went ahead and worked on it with our other co-host for this evening, Abe.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so we just got to surprise you with some highly alliterative parasitism and volcanology.
No, that was solid. And then I stepped on Abe's introduction. I'm sorry. Abe!
It's all good. Hello. Yeah, we worked on this title for at least an hour.
You Virginians, always getting in each other's way.
That's why I hate titles. That's an hour? That's a long time.
It wasn't an hour. It was, texting. We weren't like on the phone figuring it out.
That's true.
Kelly, you brought a friend.
I did bring a friend. So today I brought my friend and collaborator, Dr. Scott Egan from Rice University. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys.
We are excited to have you.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah. So Scott recently had a paper that got a ton of press, and he discovered this new trophic interaction, but I'm not going to mess it up by describing it myself. Scott, what did you find?
Sure. So my lab works on a group of insects called gall wasps, and they are these amazing little tiny wood wasps that induce their hosts, which are oak trees, to grow tumor-like growth of plant material, which we call galls. And inside that, a little baby wasp grows. And so we've been looking at those across the U.S. Gulf Coast for over a decade. But very recently, we found some that were being attacked by a parasitic vine called the love vine, or Casitha. And that interaction between a parasitic plant attacking a parasitic insect, which is itself attacking a plant, had never been described in nature before. And we were really excited to get this out here.
So one of the things that I love about working with you is that all of the cool observations that you make usually come with like a fun story about how you discovered it on a vacation or something. What's the story about how you discovered love vine?
Okay, get ready. This one's complex. So first it involved another experiment where we were sitting in Houston, Texas, realizing that we needed to get some field samples from Florida. So my postdoc, Glenn Hood, who is a co-author on the paper, flew to Florida within a day's notice, drove like 1,000 miles, and rapidly collected all of our gall formers into Ziploc bags, put them in a cooler, shipped them back to Rice, and then flew home. So that was how we accidentally collected this interaction in the first place, but we didn't know we had it at that point. So then comes the next stage in our lab where we all sit around some of the lab benches and we process these samples. And Kelly, you've been part of that in the past, where you're separating leaves from these insect-induced galls or cutting them off of stems and just trying to process each of the species that attack each of our host plants. And at that point, one or two of the undergrads kind of picked up something and said, "Hey, what is this?" To which one of the grad students in the lab, Linyi Zhang, who's also a co-author on the paper, started really looking at it under the scope. She brought it into me. We started looking at it. I told her it was probably just the seed or the fruit of the parasitic vine and that we should probably not pay attention to it. But we kept talking about it over days and eventually dissected one of them. And rather than finding some kind of fruit of this parasitic plant that I did not work on, we found one of my gall wasps inside. And then the epiphany happened. And so we had just finished processing bags and bags of our samples, and we went back into them, kind of looking for the needle in the haystack to see if this one singular example was just an anomaly or something that was repeated in nature. And we found 4 or 5 of them in our samples, which was exciting, which then led to another field trip the next growing season where I flew out to Florida and basically went back to the same field site, which is starts off with this oak tree, which is kind of a scrubby oak that's only about 4 to 5 feet tall. So like you could kind of walk into the scrub and kind of push your head through the canopy and kind of pop above the trees. And then I just kind of blurred my eyes across this site where we had seen this parasitic vine before, but never really realized what it was doing.
So if I understand this correctly, you knew that there was a bunch of parasites out there and you're just like, I'm just going to go shove my head in it.
Yes, basically, yes. So we went to this site, and this site is known to have lots of the vine and lots of our gall formers, which is the main reason why we've been going there in the past. So I'm looking across the canopy, and once I kind of blurred my eyes, I found it in tens of different places right next to my face. So then we realized this was a much more common interaction. It was actually what this vine does is really amazing. Parasitic plants in general are amazing. I've been learning a lot about them. They have these modified structures called Haestoria, which are actually like homologous with like root structures. And they form these kind of suction cup attachments to typically plants. But in this case, it was to our insect-induced galls. And we found those not just on the species we'd found in the lab, which we had accidentally collected the year before, but we actually then saw them on another gall-forming species that galls the stems of the oak trees. And we found these vines tightly wrapped in association with 2, 3, or 4 other gall formers, all in this same little system, which led us to believe, oh, this is not just a single species interaction. This is a new trophic interaction that has not been described in the past. So that's the long and short of the story.
So you mentioned that you've been learning a lot about plant parasites, which made me want to ask, what kind of work have you been doing prior to getting into this sort of parasitism? I see that you're an assistant professor of biosciences at Rice University and that you got your PhD from a little university called Vanderbilt. Abe and I have some familiarity with.
Yeah.
So what's kind of Abe got his PhD there and I got my master's there. Well, I guess Abe got his master's and PhD there.
I sure did.
Oh, awesome. Great. We can talk about Nashville then next.
Right. So I was just kind of curious, like what your research program looked like before stumbling into scrub oak multi-level parasitism.
Right. So I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and a lot of what my lab thinks about is the evolution of new species or speciation. So how one single group of interbreeding populations evolves into many different reproductively isolated species through time. And these gall wasps are one of the focal systems because in Florida, there's actually 2 sister species of oaks. There's this sand live oak, which is called Quercus geminata. And then there's another closely related species that's in more mesic soils that is called Quercus virginiana, just the southern live oak. And those 2 oaks provide the 2 environments for which our single species of gall wasp, in this case B. treaty is the focal species of this paper that we're talking about, is adapting to these 2 oaks. And we look at how adaptation to those 2 environments promotes the speciation process. And that's what our lab mainly does and why we've been collecting these critters for over a decade.
So I love your story about finding this for 2 reasons. So one, it's because you discovered it because you've been spending so much time looking at this one galler that you're able to come across these cool observations that you wouldn't get if you just studied this one species once and then moved on. And I also love that the observation was initially made by an undergrad, which is just one of the benefits of having new people without preconceived notions jump into your system with fresh eyes.
Yes.
And then they find awesome things.
Yeah. I mean, and we have benefited from that kind of fresh eyes many times in our lab. It's so fun. And I've benefited from that even during my PhD training at Vanderbilt. I had undergrads working with me at that point when I was a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame and now at Rice University in Houston. Every single time. It's great to have excited young people interested in learning and training in science to participate. It's just an unending source of energy and enthusiasm, and I just feed off of it myself.
I guess I have a question for both the parasite people on the show. Why is it always wasps? Like, what did they do in the evolutionary lottery that they're just always parasites?
I mean, first they won, right? So,
okay, that's a perspective.
So our collaborator, Andrew Forbes, recently put a paper on, I think, bioRxiv about how, for a long time, people have argued that Coleoptera is the most speciose animal group on the planet, but he's arguing that Hymenoptera are, and that's the group with the wasps. So there's a lot of them to begin with. And then Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but was there one movement to becoming parasitoids and then a big radiation, or multiple movements to becoming a parasitoid?
That is a complex kind of macroevolution question that I don't know the answer to, studying my little critters.
Okay.
I can tell you that there has been movement even within the parasitic lineages that I know of. So, for example, these crazy gall wasps actually are thought to have evolved from parasitic hymenopteran that attacked other insects. So I think that's a really interesting shift that they moved to parasitizing plants from parasitizing insects in evolutionary time. And then the other thing that I think is really important to think about here is that these wasps have this venom that they release during egg laying. And we think of that with a sting. But a lot of these gall wasps are releasing these proteins in their venom with their eggs that are messing with the immune systems of a host plant and its immune response, or other parasitic wasps that attack other insects, messing with the immune system of their host. So I think that's probably one other relationship and factor we want to think about here with why these guys do all these crazy things.
I'm absorbing that answer. I like that answer. So is this bad for the gall wasps, this love vine interaction?
Right. Good question. So in addition to just finding this interaction, we were able to uncover a couple neat associations that we hope to really dive into next year, in next year's growing season. The first is that galls that were attacked by the love vine were a different size on average than the rest of the galls of that species on the same host. So for the main focal species of wasp, B. treaty, it induces this P-shaped gall, spherical gall, on the undersides of leaves. The ones that were attacked by the love vine were on average larger than the galls on the plant that were not attacked. So that brings up all kinds of potential new questions. Is the vine just attacking galls that are larger? So that's a possibility. But another interesting possibility is maybe the vine is making the gall bigger. It's drawing out additional energy and resources, making that gall larger. So initially, that would be good for the galler, except that when we did a dissection for some number of these attacked galls, we found that in roughly half of them, there was a mummified adult gall wasp inside, which meant that the gall grew, the wasp grew within it to an adult, but then somehow was mummified inside of this gall and never actually emerged. So the galls were bigger, but inside the adult that was supposed to emerge did not and died. So there were negative interactions for that species. And then we started looking at some of the other gall wasp species on the same host plant, and we found that a stem swelling gall called Caloritis which makes the stem just kind of form this kind of globular structure. Those galls were on average smaller than unattacked galls on the same host. So there, we don't know actually what's going on with the internal structure of those galls and whether they came out or not, but we were able to document that they were a different size. So you have these size differences in the gall structure, and with one species, you have roughly half of them that are mummified inside the gall. So yeah, there's a definite negative interaction for bee treaty when it's attacked by this love vine.
Are these like single-use galls? Like, are they made for a single wasp to grow in, and then once that wasp grows and presumably flies off, then it's abandoned?
Yes. So it depends on the species.
Okay.
So there are many different gall wasp species. Some make single-chambered galls, which would generate a single individual. Some are multi-chambered, and they'll make many, many individuals, as many as 30, 40, 50, 60 individuals we've caught coming out of a single gall in the lab. Okay, so it just depends on the species.
Got it. And so for the species that you found with the love vine, just happened to be single use?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this one was a single chamber, and inside it, you basically just cut it open, and at the center there's a little chamber, and in that chamber we found these mummified wasps.
Did you find any relationships between the presence or absence of a mummified wasp and the size of it? Like, was it just kind of all over the place? I know in general they were larger if they were attached to the vine.
Yeah. So we did look at so on average, the bee treaty galls were larger if they were attacked by the vine. And then we just looked at a subset of the galls. Oh, I'm trying to remember how we thought about this. I may space on this one. But I think we looked at like a smaller subset of the galls to kind of dig in a little deeper there. And we still found that difference, that the attack galls were slightly larger. But yeah, good question. Lots more questions have emerged from this than we were able to document in this little short paper trying to describe the trophic interaction.
Like all good science should.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So after I finished reading this paper, my first thought was how great it is to be a human. Bellicnuck Treaty has how many different a bunch of parasitoids associated with it, and probably some predators, and now it also has to worry about a plant stealing all of its food. It's just got they've got so many things going against it. Right. But our lives are pretty good. Yeah, no, I mean, and Kelly, you bring up a good thing about the biology of this system. Not thinking about this love vine is that you have the host plant, you have the gall former, and that gall former is attacked by a whole group of predatory wasps called parasitoids that cause massive mortality among the gall wasp in a typical situation. And now you have this new vine interacting and doing the same thing. So that's another cool question we're interested in the next year, is how this vine and vine attack upsets that that kind of tritrophic interaction that we've been thinking about in the past. Right now, we've only been able to just kind of talk a little bit about the interaction between the gall wasp and the vine, but we know nothing about what happens when the vine's also attacking the same exact host plant. What happens when that vine attacks the gall and there's a parasitoid or some other insect that's living inside? We have no idea of the interactions and what might happen there.
I'm sure we've done this on the show before, Kelly, but can we define the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid?
Sure. Scott, you want to do that?
Oh, you're the parasitologist. I'll defer to you.
Yeah, so I think of parasitoids as a category under parasites. So parasites are sort of like anything that has a long interaction with another organism where it extracts resources from that organism. And parasitoids in particular require the death of their host and then have a stage after they kill their host where they live free living in the environment for a while. So they're particularly bad parasites because they have to kill their host in order to complete their life cycle, whereas something like a hookworm in a person doesn't kill the host unless the intensity gets way too high, but typically doesn't kill the host. So that's the difference. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Woo!
I think it makes sense to me.
And so Abe asked about the effect on the wasp, but what about the effect on the tree?
Right. So we don't know who the ultimate winners or losers are in this situation yet, because we're still kind of exploring it. But in general, love vine can overtake their host plants. They basically form these vines that go all over the top of the canopy and effectively choke out individual plants. So love vine, and there's another parasitic vine in Florida, have been reported to be, agricultural pests. So they can actually attack economically important crops and cause crop damage and reduce yield. So these guys do have effects on the host plant, but we don't know exactly what's going on in this system because this is kind of a new interaction for us. I can tell you from the gall wasp side, though, oak trees harbor hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes millions of gall formers on a single large live oak tree. And those oaks continue to grow year after year, put out acorns. You may see some structural damage where a branch may break due to the weight of gall formers when they get in very high numbers.
Oh, wow.
But in general, there seems to be some kind of tolerance that the plant can have with very high levels of gall formers in certain years.
So I actually, this is something I meant to mention during our meeting the other day, Scott, but didn't. So Scott and I work on a galler called Basedia pallidus, the crypt gall wasp. It makes a little compartment inside the stems. And when I was in the field, I noticed that a lot of the branch after the crypt was often dead. Does that make sense, Ryan and Abe?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there are different kinds of galls. You can get galls that are like on the leaf and extract energy to make the gall. And then you've got this gall that's in the middle of the stem. And I was talking to a grad student at the University of Central Florida named Jordan, who studies plants. And I mentioned that it seemed like this galler killed the stems. And he was like, of course, it's interrupting the flow of water and nutrients through the stem. So the ones on the leaf.
As soon as you said that, it sounded like putting a tourniquet on.
Yeah, so he said the ones on the leaf are maybe not as bad. He suggested, because he doesn't work in this system, so he was just kind of, spitballing as I threw information at him, that maybe the ones that are extracting energy aren't as bad as the ones that are in the stem that are essentially putting a tourniquet on, like Ryan said. And I hadn't thought of that, and I thought that was interesting. So maybe some are worse than others. Kind of depends on where they are, maybe?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's a good point, Kelly. Yeah, the ones that attack like the stems are the ones that also cause the structural damage, where the stems will break sometimes on windy days and storms. So that's very interesting. I've noticed the same thing in Basetia here in Texas, is that they will occasionally just kind of kill the branch or branchlet that's growing out in that direction, but not always, which is interesting. It's not 100% of the time. So they will still be able to leaf out and grow on occasion.
So in general, a particular species of wasp will target a specific area of the tree?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So cynipid gall wasps are highly host specific. So they usually attack mostly just a single species of oak or a group of very, very closely related species of oaks. And then in addition to that, they will only form galls on usually a very specific part of the plant. They can only induce galls on the underside of a leaf on a mid vein. They're very specific to the tissue. Because when you really think about what's going on here, the wasp is somehow manipulating the undifferentiated tissues of its host. And they grow very structurally complex tumors or galls, where they have like an outer structure, inner structure. They will concentrate some of the plant defensive chemicals on the outside of their galls, or even have the plant grow additional defensive structures on the outside, like they'll overexpress plant hairs, trichomes, on the outside of the gall just to defend it against all the predators and parasitoids and now parasitic plants that try to attack them.
Vines.
So yeah, they're very, very specific. And then another crazy part of their biology that I haven't even told you about is they actually have a sexual and an asexual generation that they alternate between in an obligate manner. And each of those generations induces a different gall on a different part of the plant. So the focal species we've talked about, B. treaty, where it grows on the underside of leaves and makes that little sphere, that's the asexual females inside. That's the asexual generation growing. When they emerge, they descend down to root material where they lay their eggs into the roots. And that little egg, and when it hatches, that little larvae, induces a giant multi-chambered golden red gall right beneath the leaf litter, which is with the sexual generation grows. They emerge in the spring, mate, and go back up to new leaves to induce that leaf gall.
Every week I learn something new about gall wasps that blows my mind. I mean, I knew about the alternating generation thing. That's not this week's new thing, but like, they're so awesome.
Yeah, I met a couple scientists in my training who studied systems for a very specific reason, studying speciation, adaptation, the genetics of complex traits, but they were systems that were just so full of additional questions. And I really appreciated that as a way to build a research program, to have a lab with lots of questions for graduate students and undergraduate students to work with you. So that was something that I learned during my PhD, working on a group of leaf beetles where I was interested again in speciation, how they were adapting to maple and willow trees and evolving into different species. But they also had ploidy issues. There were asexual gynogenetic parasite lineages that, messed with the sexual lineage. It's just bizarre things. Every time, insects are so complex and crazy that there's just a million questions you could ask them. It's so fun.
My question is seeing a parasite go after, well, I guess I kind of have two questions. One, if the love vine is actually sometimes killing the wasp, then is it potentially advantageous to the tree? And so could this be a case where the tree would actually encourage parasitism or at least not fight off parasitism of its parasites in order to increase its own fitness?
So that's a really interesting question that we don't yet know the answer to. I will say that in this region where we detected this trophic interaction, the proportion of galls that were attacked by the love vine on average is still pretty low. So it represented like 3 or 4% of all the galls were attacked by this love vine, which when there's tens of thousands of galls is a lot of interactions, but I don't think there's enough of an interaction here yet to see selection moving the bar. But we don't know, again, who the winners or losers are in the outcome of this yet. We're still kind of exploring that. But it's a really good question to think about, that a parasitic vine could be preening the plant it's trying to attack and removing other, parasites off of its host. I mean, that's certainly something we've seen in nature before.
Right. And it really was a constant gardener. My other question is, now that we've seen parasitism on parasites, is that in and of itself surprising and something that we think folks in your guys' field are going to go look for now? Or is the idea that parasites themselves would also be susceptible to parasitism not exactly the big finding from this? It's just the specific system that is. No,
good question. Yeah, so really two things there. One, in these groups of organisms where you have host plants, where you have some herbivore, in our case, gall wasp, and then you have this predatory community called the parasitoids, you do see hyperparasitism, which is in fact what you described, where you see some parasitic wasps attacking other parasitic wasps that are attacking our gall wasps. So we have seen that repeatedly in the past. But what's interesting here is that people have been studying gall wasps for a long time, and they're all over the globe. And people have been studying parasitic plants for a long time, and they're also all over the globe. So I do think people are going to start looking for and finding this interaction between these internal parasites, the gall wasp, and this parasitic plant attacking the same host plant. I do think people are going to start looking for this, and I will be shocked if people don't find it in other systems. I'm already looking for it in alternative systems that I also work in. I'm sure people will uncover it soon somewhere.
Very cool. All right, wrap it up, Kelly.
All right. So there are a couple people who I think of as like my models for how science should be done right. And you're one of those people for me. And so my question for you, you have a couple different papers that have come out and been like huge. And they were things that, as far as I can tell, were not things that you had been looking for, that you just discovered that ended up being these huge things that everybody gets excited about. So what tips do you have for scientists for like how to be the people who discover these kinds of awesome things that maybe you were looking for, but maybe you weren't?
Okay.
It's big and open-ended.
First, I would say thank you. That's super kind. And I actually feel the same way about you, Kelly. You're kind of an amazing biologist, and I have been really excited about learning all the things that you do. So right back at you. So that's an excellent question. And I really don't know the answer to it off the top of my head, but I will tell you a couple things that have inspired this work. One is a article written by Doug Fatuma, probably 20 or 30 years ago, I think in American Naturalist, where he talked about the importance of natural history in understanding complex ecological and evolutionary phenomenon. And I read that as a graduate student, and that really inspired me to really know a group of organisms in great detail. I had no insight at that early stage of my career what that group of organisms would be. So I just kind of dove in and just pressed on with my curiosity and hoped that eventually I'd kind of catch my gears somewhere and be able to do that. So that essay in American Naturalist was really inspiring to me. And then there was I don't know if it was a preface to a book written by Warren Abrahamson and Art Weiss on tritrophic interactions. And these guys work on gall systems, a wonderful system called the Eurasta fly gall that induces stem galls on Solidago. And they've explored all these kind of interesting interactions using another gall former system. But the preface to that book is written, I think, by May Berenbaum. And she says something like, why it's really important to dive into the dirty details and just get everything out of a single system and understand everything, because it's that extra work that allows us to learn something new. And that essay also kind of just inspired the work on gall wasp and wanting to know everything about them and just to kind of be a whole systems biologist for a system where I'm an evolutionary biologist. I want to understand speciation, but I also want to understand the complex interactions in nature in general. So that's kind of what drives my work.
Awesome. And it seems to be paying off.
Thanks. I'm having fun. And I have great people to work with, which is really lucky.
And it's really cool that your work is getting, the kind of press that I don't know that parasite research always gets. So congratulations on that. That must be really exciting.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah, it's crazy to be interviewed, by entities that you read regularly, like the National Geographic or the New York Times. That's kind of wild. And I should say that all of these projects, someone's interviewed. In the case right here, like I'm being interviewed, but I am a representative of a team of people that worked on all these projects, right? So somebody has to be the first author or the senior author, or whatever. But each one of the people that was working on this was really important. And so really, I'm just the figurehead of a team of people that's been working really, really hard on all these different projects.
Go team!
Yeah. Congrats to all of the team. And if any of them get a first author pub out of any of the follow-up projects that I'm sure you're all working on, they're also welcome to come on and talk about the work.
Okay. That sounds really awesome. I'd love for them to be able to do that.
Yes, because as you mentioned, lots more questions have come up and in any good maybe not any good interview, but as is the style, sometimes we asked you some questions where you were like, I don't really know. And that's exciting because that means there's more to come.
Absolutely. Yep. We're excited to get out in the field again.
Are there places on the internet where people can follow you or follow along with the work that your lab is doing?
Yeah. So we're pretty low tech, which is maybe I spend a lot of time on natural history and not a lot of time on the internet. So I love
some of the bigger differences in our careers.
Yeah, I love science communication, and I'm so excited to read things and I consume it myself. But I'm pretty basic. I have a website that's pretty crummy that I keep on my own, and I have a regular email address. So that's about it. Sorry, I'm just super low tech.
No, that's okay. Would you like us to send people to your website where you do actually have, it is, you may say it's very low tech, but it is more fully fleshed out than a lot of other lab websites that I've seen in our 10 years of doing this show.
Okay, awesome. Yes, if you Google Egan Lab at Rice University, you can look at our lab website. You can see the work we do, the people, the teams that have contributed to this work, from the postdocs and graduate students and undergraduates, and a list of our publications, which include this cool paper on the plant parasitic vine, but also the cool paper I was lucky enough to work on with Kelly on the crazy Euderus wasps that manipulate the behavior of the Bassetia gall wasp, which was super exciting that we did last year.
So fun.
Awesome. And I think Kelly told us about that on the show. So I will find that episode in our archives and link to that. And I will link to your website in the show notes for this episode. And with that, I just want to thank you, Scott, for giving us some of your time this evening.
Cool. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I had a great time.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Thanks,
nice
Scott.
to meet you all. Yep. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Well, thanks again to Scott for coming on the mic. Thank you, Kelly, for arranging that.
My pleasure. It's always great talking to Scott.
It's always great when one of you bothers to arrange an interview for me, so I can just show up and talk.
Happy to do
I say
it.
bothers as if Kelly just did the nice thing, and I'm using language as if she was the one who was making it a problem. But no, Kelly, that was awesome. You brought it all together and made it happen.
And that was a very
Woo!
pleasant conversation.
Every conversation with Scott is pleasant.
Let us toast to parasites in our next segment.
Woo!
What are we drinking?
I will always drink to that.
In a field outside of town, we could always be alone. Carry a blanket, maybe a basket, and that's it. Innocence was the key. I was locked up, never free, until you turned me. Like vines we intertwine, carelessly growing up and growing old. Life was on our tongues. It tasted heavenly, so good. I wake up and I feel alone. I was just asleep, right where I belong, inside this sad
Not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. I assume it is some form of the chemical parasite, ethanol. Kelly, you were excited, so let's start with you.
So I have recently started going to this butcher called J&M Stock in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they have this collection of local wines and beers and ciders. And so I picked up Potter's Craft Cider, and this particular craft cider is Guava Galaxy Cider.
Oh,
So let's give it a shot.
I love
I
guava.
think I've had some stuff from them. That sounds very familiar.
They're from Free Union, Virginia. And so this is supposed to be tropical, tart, and aromatically intense. So
So does
Oh,
the
is it-
Galaxy, is that referring to the hops? Like, is it a
you're
hop
asking
cider?
the wrong person, my friend.
Yes.
Yes, and it is.
I've actually had this, and it is okay. I want to hear what you think. It is Galaxy hops, right?
Okay, yes, it does say Galaxy hops now on the can. So first, I would say that the description is spot on. This is a little tartar than I would usually go with for a cider. However, it tastes delicious. And upon second sip, I'm definitely going to finish this 4-pack real easy.
Nice.
So I'm digging it. Yeah.
Cideries are becoming the hot thing here in the district, Kelly.
Yes, there are a couple in the Charlottesville area, and they're all amazing. I really love living in Virginia.
We could, there's at least 3 or 4 cideries in the district. We could do a little cider day if you ever had a day where you could, drink during the day and not have to worry about the chitlins.
Drop the kids off somewhere. And
Yeah.
I should say every sip of the cider that I have, I like it more.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it wasn't what I expected because it's not like most ciders that I've had. So that threw me at first. But now that my mind is open, I'm digging it.
Nice. So I picked it up in the store probably a few weeks ago. Guava is one of my favorite fruits, and it's very rare to come across it in the U.S. So anytime now, it's like I love it, and
All right.
in California we had a tree, so there's never really an issue. So every time I come across something with guava, I want to try it, and I was actually impressed with this. I like that it's a little bit tart than a little more tart than the standard cider, because to me that makes it more unique, different. it's really nice.
Awesome. So that's 2 thumbs up.
Yeah.
Well, I very nearly had a cider tonight as well.
Oh.
But I ended up not because it wasn't already in the fridge, and I've had a tall boy in the fridge for a while that I've been wanting to get to on the show. And this is the Juiced in Time Upland Brewing Company Side Trail. And I got this one because very recently Abe and I did a hike that was very much upland on somewhat of a side trail. I thought it was a good beer to celebrate that hike.
Woo, solid. Is it tasty?
Yeah, it's good. This is the last of a 4-pack, so I didn't need to be convinced to finish the 4-pack. I've been saving the final one for a recording. So, yes, very good. Yeah, it's their experimental IPA series, and it's, it's another one of the hazy New England style IPAs, which I'm on record as not being the biggest fan of, but they seem to have they're parasitizing all of my IPAs, so I've been forced to learn to tolerate them, even if they're causing a reduction in fitness.
Did you just use parasitize in a negative way?
Yeah, like most people.
I'm confused about the point you're trying to make, Ryan.
Is the gusano in mezcal a parasite, Abe? I guess it might.
I guess so. I mean, it just it is. It just gets into the agave and into the maguey and starts eating it.
See, it's funny. Like you think of apples, bad apple has a worm in it, but there's not you don't think of apple brandy as having a little gusano at the bottom.
That's
anyway,
because they were not in a hurry.
I know, Abe. You have strong opinions about mezcal, but what strong opinion are you bringing about what you're actually drinking this evening?
Oh, I am having double IPA today from Wicked Weed Brewing Company out of
I almost had a beer from Wicked Weed too. I almost completely overlap both of you guys. This is absurd.
Really?
It's almost as if we're all buying drinks in the same general market.
So yesterday I went to the beer store with Beverly, and I kid you not, I looked at every single beer label in the store because I wanted a beer specifically for this episode. And so the one that I found is called Freak of Nature.
Perfect.
And I thought it was so, because parasites are just freaks.
Take that, Kelly.
You mean that in a nice way, right, Abe?
I do, totally. It's like, what a freak of nature. Look at him go.
Thank you. Yes, Abe, we're on the same page.
Yeah.
You are still invited to my home.
Great. And it is actually very delicious.
Well, now to talk about something else that's terrible. Volcanoes.
Even worse.
I'll just make both of you mad at me, and then you can team up against me.
I'm pretty sure you don't think volcanoes are terrible, because volcanoes are beautiful.
Could have filled the garden with all the flowers that you gave me, but none of them where I was. The problem with history, it keeps coming back like weed. And when nothing feels enough, at least you told me how to love. But it keeps growing back like weed. Baby, just open your eyes to see he's growing from inside me. And I just don't know what I can do. I thought I got him mad through. Like weeds, like weeds, like weeds, yeah.
All right, so in typical science sort of fashion, I posted a few different stories for the both of you to choose from. I posted 4. Kelly, you narrowed it down to 2, and then Abe picked the final one. Surprise, surprise, surprise. It's about volcanoes. So tell us what's going on, Abe.
Yeah, so not only about volcanoes, it's also about Iceland, because, it's made up of all volcanoes. So this article is about a recently published study, and I'll mention the name of the article first because it got picked up by the media very quickly and spread with a message that was not quite ever at all even in the same words included in the original research paper. So the The article that we are talking about is titled, "Is Iceland's Katla volcano really about to erupt?" And so this article was written in response to a slurry of news reports claiming that a new study showed that Katla, one of Iceland's largest, most dangerous volcanoes, was about to erupt. And all of this was basically information taken out of context from a published study that came out recently in Geophysical Research Letters. The title of that study is Globally Significant CO2 Emissions from Katla, a subglacial volcano in Iceland. The study itself was led by Evgenia Ilinskaya. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, but it's the lead author based out of the University of Leeds. And one thing that was very interesting that they found that was slightly different from what we understood about these volcanoes in Iceland previously is that the emission of CO2 from Katla, this subglacial volcano, is a lot higher than was previously thought to be. There's a lot more CO2 being released. Just in general, it's actually a signature that can be picked up. And I believe in the study they mentioned something like 4 or 5% of global CO2 emissions might be coming from these subglacial volcanoes. And I believe Katla alone is about 5%. And it's not insignificant for a single volcano, but in the bigger context is still kind of a very tiny amount of the overall emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Can I interrupt to ask why it's releasing carbon? Is it just burning up stores of carbon because the magma is so hot or something?
Not necessarily. So
if I've learned one thing from being friends with Abe for a long time, it's that when a volcano does something, the answer is usually, well, we don't really know because it's underground.
Well, what is our best guess for why volcanoes release any carbon?
A troll poured baking soda into the acid and it caused a phreatic eruption, and that releases CO2.
Makes sense.
I said troll because it's Iceland.
Yeah, no, I was with you on that.
Okay, making sure we got our mythology straight here.
So the source itself is, of course, the magma chamber beneath the volcanic structure. And this is something that volcanoes just naturally do. They release gases, one of them being carbon dioxide, CO2, but also sulfur dioxide and a host of others, methane. And Iceland is probably one of the most, among the most active volcanic areas in the planet. And so the CO2 flux at these volcanoes is monitored pretty regularly, but that's still, it's very time and resource intensive to be monitored for these gases. So to be able to understand where it's coming from and like the causes of all of these releases, these are all natural releases. So it doesn't mean that something is happening. We just happen to measure higher amounts of CO2 coming out of this volcano, which is different than what our previous understanding was. And that's the beauty of these studies, is going back to our conversation with Scott earlier today. We found something that was surprising and different from our understanding, and it brings up a few extra questions that require additional work to answer. So lots of different scenarios that could be making the CO2 as flux out of this volcano as high as it is. But one thing that should be clear is this doesn't necessarily mean that the activity is increased. And so that's something that this article is trying to highlight. Just because we are finding things that are different about this volcano doesn't mean that it's inherently all of a sudden more dangerous or more ready to erupt. And as I've stressed in the past many times, we just can't predict eruptions. And one of the frustrating things in science communication is when, you provide some kind of results from your studies and you try to do it in as simple language as possible, and it still gets misreported or misconstrued. And changed into something that's completely not. And so earlier this month, the report, the original report of this new study, eventually evolved into, oh my God, this volcano Katla is about to erupt again. So we are now preparing for another 2010 Iceland eruption-esque event that is going to stop all air space travel, between Europe and the Americas.
Right. So, and it sounds like a lot of the English language reporting that's been overblown and overhyped has been coming out of the UK because they were more impacted by the eruption in 2010 than the US was, but they also speak English, so we can see their publications, their news outlets more easily without the need for translation. And a few kind of just basic facts and figures about Katla. When you say it's a subglacial volcano, that means that the volcano is actually under an ice sheet, correct?
Somewhat.
At least partially iced over?
It is interacting directly with a glacier or in an ice sheet. In the case of Katla, the crater where the entire eruption would happen, or the main site where the eruptions would happen, because it does have flank eruptions like we saw in the case of Eyjafjallajökull in 2010. It can occur in the crater
area.
area.
When he does that, Kelly. I hate it.
I can't believe he said it he didn't trip over it at all.
He practices. Don't let him. Don't.
To this day, I still practice twice a week. So Katla has a summit area that is entirely covered by a small ice sheet, or a very large glacial.
Right, and so it hasn't erupted enough to break the ice cover in since 1918, so 100 years. Right. Which is kind of interesting, but what this study found, and one of the kind of big takeaway points that I think is, would be more relevant to folks like Kelly and I who think about, animal systems and climate, is that they estimate that this volcano, Katla alone, is contributing up to 4% of the total global volcanic carbon dioxide emissions.
So I think an important baseline bit of information here is how much of the overall carbon output do volcanoes make up overall? So is it 5% of 1% of all the carbon output, or is it 5% of 75%? Does that make sense?
I think the sense I got from reading this stuff is that it was unexpected that an active but non-erupting volcano would be emitting that significant a percentage of CO2, and so I'm not sure it's necessarily known, and maybe I think this might have been the dinner bell to like, hey, go look at this now. Let's figure this part out. But maybe you can correct me on that. Okay.
No, that's a good way to put it, is that one volcano emitting this much, releasing this much CO2 it's not normal. It doesn't mean something is about to happen. It just means it's significantly different than what we thought was the case. So it's worth noting, it's worth publishing, and it's worth studying some more. And that's really the message that the authors are trying to drive across, is that, hey, look, we found something different and new. We need to study more.
To clarify, is the point that we need to do a better job at quantifying this value for all volcanoes because apparently we don't have a good framework for thinking about it? Or is it that we have a pretty good idea of how much carbon volcanoes should be putting into the atmosphere, and this one's an outlier, so we need to study this one in particular to figure out what's happening here?
So I think the point is more that volcanoes, even when they're not actively erupting, can still be releasing a high amount of CO2.
Yeah, if I read it correctly, it was, this may be an outlier, but we also haven't really been measuring this as a source. And so we need to actually start measuring things that we didn't think we needed to measure before.
Correct. Yeah. I would agree with that interpretation, Ryan. And I think, it really highlights what they're driving here is we should be doing more sampling for gases specifically, and not just at the volcanoes where we already do that because they're active, but potentially in large volcanoes that we know have erupted in recent time that maybe they're not actively showing signs of volcanic activity every day. And that could be everything as simple as you go to Yellowstone and you see degassing You see geysers and fumaroles. That's active degassing. You'll see very little of this on Katla. A lot of it might be obscured by the
Ice.
small ice cap at the top.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, going back to Ryan's statement, like we might just have missed it because we're not measuring every volcano that's not active. And you know, a lot of times we tend to justify the expense of measuring these kinds of parameters, gas releases. We justify them by when something becomes active and slightly more of a threat, you know, and at that point you kick in and say, all right, something is different than what was happening before. So we should pay more attention to it just so we understand how it's changing. Does that make sense?
It does. I have one more silly baseline question that will reveal that I don't know anything about volcanoes.
Well, the answer is it means kettle from Old Norse. Katla. Is that what your question? What does Katla mean?
No, that's a good question that I should have asked, but that's not the question that I had. Okay. My question is, how many volcanoes of this sort are there? Like, is Katla one of 20? So proportionally, it's producing about as much carbon as you would expect, or are there like thousands and thousands of volcanoes like this?
Well, in Iceland alone, there are about 6 or 7 under ice caps that are significant, I believe. That's just Iceland. There are not very many areas in the world that are both highly volcanically active and glaciated, or actively being glaciated, you know, whether it's with glaciers or ice caps or whatever size of ice structure. Antarctica would be the other major one where we know there is a volcanic activity happening. A little bit harder to detect that because there's, 3 to 4 kilometers of ice over the crust in Antarctica. And then there are some areas in the Andes that are volcanically active with some glacial cover that's quickly going away. That's just ice and volcano interactions. That
I have an exact number for the number of volcanoes that have erupted in the past 10,000 years, if you want that.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
1,434.
That we know.
Volcanoes with eruptions that we know of from the last 10,000 years. So that's the Holocene. That's the end of the last ice age. Currently, as of today, 41, well, I guess actually as of the 22nd of August, so as of a month ago, 41 volcanoes with ongoing eruptions in the world.
All right.
And I know that because the Smithsonian Institution maintains a global volcanism program with databases of volcanoes of various kinds.
I love that.
Isn't that neat?
It is fantastic. It's actually, I received the weekly report.
Do you really? I didn't know that. I just found out about this.
It is fantastic. It tells you what volcanoes are still active, what new volcanoes have become active in the last week, what volcanoes have stopped being active or changed in their status of activity in the last week. So I very much encourage anybody who's interested in finding out what volcanoes or even what areas, or like Ryan just found, how many are active. You can go to the volcano.si.edu, and this site is fantastic not only in that they maintain this active database of eruptions and activity, they also have a database of volcanoes, period. So you can go in and pull up a volcano and you'll have the entire history of eruptions for that volcano that we know of. And that's one caveat that I'll put on the number that Ryan just mentioned. Those are the eruptions that we know of. There are potentially hundreds, if not thousands more that we don't.
Abe, they couldn't put a number on the internet if it wasn't true.
That's true. That's a good point. So this is exactly the number of eruptions that have occurred.
We're revoking your scientist license, Ryan.
Because I'm sure if you asked me the exact number of fossils we found, I could give you an exact number that was definitely correct. So I think this is a pretty reliable source here. It's probably more than 42. But Abe, this leads a little bit to the topic that I pitched earlier that you said you wanted to talk about and that Kelly was also interested in, is the question, is volcanic activity increasing worldwide.
And the answer?
No. You just think it is because we are reporting on it better, although talking about Katla and the reporting that went on there makes it seem like we are not reporting it as well. So no wonder you think it's increasing because you're being told volcanoes are going to erupt when they are not.
Right.
So this is actually more of a psychological effect than it is a geological effect.
There were 3 different psychology effects, right?
I was mostly going to talk about recency bias and primacy bias, but did you want to talk about one, Kelly?
I'm just going to back off.
Oh, what were you trying to drive at? Were you trying to make a joke and I stepped on it?
No. Nope, I wasn't making a joke. But I appreciate that you thought that I was making a joke. I think I just remembered 3, but there were actually 2. Thanks for giving me the benefit of the doubt.
And I do want to, and I definitely want to touch on communication and technology, but let's do that after psychology.
Well, I don't want to get too deep into this article. We will link to it for people to check it out. And it's also a question that is answered in a little bit more scientific geologic detail on the Smithsonian website, which we'll also link to. But there's a thing called recency bias, which is you tend to believe an idea strongly when something has happened more recently. So the idea of a basketball player being on fire, like if they've made a previous basket, you believe they're more likely to make the next basket, even though those two things aren't correlated. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're two independent trials of basket baking. I'm now imagining an NBA player weaving a basket. Man, LeBron James really weaves a great wicker basket. This held all my apples.
I mean, if he's on fire, I don't think that basket's going to turn out.
I should have said
well.
peach basket because that's what was Dr. Naismith used for the original. Now I'm kicking myself. Sorry, Dr. Naismith. Anyway, so it's just the idea that like if you've recently seen a thing happen, you're more likely to believe that same thing will happen again. And then there's an idea called primacy bias, where your brain favors the information you first learned, which is why I feel like this happens to me all the time. I'll be in a conversation with somebody and then I'll remember like, oh, I know a weird fact about this, but it's a fact that I learned in like elementary school or middle school. And then I'll start to say it and I'll be like, I actually have no idea if this is true because I was told it in middle school and believed it because I was not a skeptical person back then. But then now I realize I need to look it up, but I'll never forget it. Even if I find out it's wrong, I'll have a really hard time forgetting the not correct fact.
That happened to me today.
What was it?
The Ring Around the Rosie song that kids sing. I was told that song came up during the bubonic plague years.
I've heard that.
And I'm reading A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived by Adam Rutherford. And he said that the people who study that kind of stuff are all like, no, that's totally wrong. I don't know why all the kids think that that's true. But apparently that there's not really good evidence that the Ring Around the Rosie song has anything to do with the bubonic plague.
Yeah. The same for the fornication under consent of the king thing. What that would be an acronym for if you put the first letters together. You didn't hear about this one?
Nope.
No. I'm mentally piecing it together right now, but
fornication under consent
I got it.
of the king.
Yep.
There's a whole linguistic thing where we come up with fake explanations for words where we ascribe them to being acronyms and make up a story based on the acronym to explain the origin of the word, even though in at least modern English, acronyms are a pretty recent thing. Like nobody in the 1300s, was using acronyms for stuff.
It's just striking me that's very funny that that's only occurred to me now.
Yeah. Like, why would they use acronyms? So anyway.
Right.
So recency bias and primacy bias, two very interesting things. And then as we were kind of talking about, people are reporting on volcanoes more, especially because, when there's a really big news story like Eyjafjallajökull, how to do, Abe?
Close.
I'm impressed.
I think it makes the news media more likely to cover those stories in the future because there was one that had this really big impact. And then we were also, even though we are not doing a perfect job of monitoring, we are monitoring volcanoes better. So there is more data available on the state of more volcanoes worldwide. Because of global population increases, more people live near dangerous volcanoes. And then it's just the general overabundance and quick spreading of information that has happened because of how connected the world is. So in the same way, you hear about like a murder in a town you don't live in, and you're upset by it, even though it doesn't really have an impact on your day-to-day life, but it gets reported on and you feel an emotional response to it, even though it's not necessarily something that you need to be informed of to go about your day. So that kind of has a psychological effect on us. And so all these things coming together gives people a perception that volcanic activity is increasing, where it has actually stayed pretty level, which was why that second half of our theme this week was median magma. We're just coasting along the median. Does that make sense? I kind of tried to run through that quickly. So we didn't,
Yeah, and the big point here is we have changed very quickly in the way that we receive news, right? And so you think about 20 years ago without Twitter and without any of these, something that happened even in Australia would not get to you for probably days. Now, minutes after something happens, you know about it, or at least if you're tuned in, the information spreads around the globe in seconds. And so that has a massive effect, because now, even if there's nobody there to witness it, we have satellites that can pick up, in this particular case, when we're talking about eruptions, we can detect eruptions from satellites. And so all of a sudden, now we know where all of the eruptions are happening. We didn't have this technology, a decade or 2 decades ago, or we weren't using it in this manner if we did have it. And so it's really a big shift. And I actually started noticing that about 4 or 5 years ago with earthquakes in California.
Yeah, there's that great XKCD comic from Randall Munroe where
exactly.
he shows that seismic waves, P and S waves from earthquakes travel at a certain rate through the Earth's crust.
Faster.
And so if you are on a good enough network, you could tweet. You could tweet about the earthquake, and it could reach somebody before the actual seismic event reaches them.
Right.
Depending on the speed of the transmission and the speed of the quake and their distance from the epicenter.
Yeah, exactly. And so this was the topic that came up years ago, where people all of a sudden were like, oh my God, there are all of a sudden a lot more earthquakes happening around the world. And back to the point is, no, now you're just finding out about them very quickly and, very consistently.
So is the same thing happening with hurricanes? Or are we actually getting more of those?
That's different.
We're probably getting more of those because the driver
that was
of
my
hurricanes.
sense also.
Yeah.
That's different. That's where we're actually, that's, climate and weather patterns. We are actually affecting those. It's really hard for us to affect things that happened underneath the ground, like in the Earth's crust. There's not a whole lot we can do to influence things down
Let's
there.
not get into a whole fracking thing, but
that's a good point. But
the whole thing with hurricanes is that we know that ocean temperature is one of the primary drivers of the frequency and strength of hurricanes, and we know that ocean temperature is increasing. And so essentially, if you think of the ocean as the battery that powers up each hurricane as it forms in the ocean and sends it slamming into the continent, that battery is storing more and more charge because it's getting hotter and hotter.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my sense, that hurricanes were actually increasing in frequency, but I wasn't sure, given these things, if I was fooling myself.
And that's one of those things where, like, climatologists are very careful to say we can't pin any one hurricane on climate change, because obviously hurricanes were happening before we were anthropogenically affecting the climate. But at the same time, there is going to be a general trend, in the same way that climate itself is a general trend, in probably increased frequency and increased power from the hurricanes, due to the very simple relationship between water temperature and hurricane power and size.
Which is why I feel like it's so important to have journalists who know about statistics, or at least sort of vaguely have a sense of statistics, so that they can say stuff like this, like, hey, volcanoes, this is a bad one, but this isn't a trend, versus hurricanes, this is a bad one, and it's part of a trend.
Yeah, I had a friend reach out to me after Florence, asking, they were confused by the way that we talk about things like these big storms and floods. And they were like, what do they mean when they say a 10-year, 100-year, 1,000-year storm? Because that's not something that I think people, unless you've had any sort of training in the subject, know. Fortunately, I did know, because of, I think, some class Abe and I took at Vanderbilt together. But basically, a 1,000-year storm means that it is a storm that has a 1 in 1,000 probability of occur. It has a one storm in every 1,000 years will be as powerful as that storm, which is not a very elegant way of stating it. And he was like, why do we do it that way? And I assume, and if anybody's listening who knows the answer, that has to do with some archaic way of how we've measured meteorological data over, it's one of the oldest continually gathered data sets in human history is weather. And so I assume it's some archaic form that made sense to people in the 1800s that just isn't super clear to us now.
Right. And it's also been
that part of it.
It's continued to be a method used to assess with flooding levels of risk, and this comes into play very heavily when you're deciding whether or not to build 50 feet from that river or 75 feet from that river.
Right. If 50 feet is in the 100-year floodplain, which means one flood in every 100 years is going to hit that spot, versus 75 feet maybe in the 1,000-year floodplain, so only one flood in every 1,000 years. That's an order of magnitude different risk, but it doesn't feel that way with the way we talk about. To me, anyway, it doesn't feel
right. And
like
it's 20 feet of difference.
Yeah, but that's how it happens.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see 538 style journalism permeate the way we talk about these sorts of things.
Well, you and every time Patrick sends me a listing to when they open up a job for a new science reporter, but that's neither here nor there.
God, I would love to work for 538.
I don't think I could handle it. I think I'd be even more stressed out than I am all the time.
Well, I would rather keep studying my parasites, but I do love 538.
I had to take a little bit of a break from 538 after the election because they weren't pissed off enough. But I've been going back now because, with the midterms coming up and me getting nervous, I've been checking the site. So
I thought that their response was reasonable, but whatever. Anyway, we don't have to talk about 538.
Nothing is reasonable anymore. I'm freaking out. You guys want to know about another risky activity? Feedback from the listeners.
Oh.
Head over to our final segment of the show, the PaleoPOW.
Pow, pow.
I set out to prove the world wrong. I set out to prove the world wrong. And all the lessons I've learned, all the lessons I've learned, all the lessons I have learned. Have only taught me that I'm stubborn. That I set out to prove the world wrong. And the funny thing is, the funny thing is, the funny thing is, I knew that all along. When I set out to prove the world wrong.
PaleoPOW is a segment of the show where we deal with feedback from the listeners. And it's a great segment, and we have a lot of fun with it, but we need to start with something a little less fun this time, and I need to read a brief statement about an update to our Twitter account's policy. So back when we began the show, Twitter actually was kind of a tame place, or at least felt that way. So we had a sort of an unofficial policy that we were pretty consistent about, where anyone who interacted with us, we would follow them back. So if you mentioned us, if you added us, if you responded to something, we'd follow you back. And in that time, we only had to block one person for being abusive, and we repeatedly asked them to stop, and they didn't, and so we blocked them. However, it recently came to my attention that the show's account was following a man who was harassing female scientists. A friend of mine and a former guest of the show looked up this dude's account, and when you do that, Twitter tells you if anyone you follow happens to also be following the account you're looking at. And so they saw that we were following him, and they let me know, which I was embarrassed about, obviously. So we unfollowed him. I asked if there was anything else we could do or should do to make things right on our end, or just generally help out that situation. So obviously one big change we're going to do is we're going to be a little bit more careful about who we choose to follow. So if when you interact with us and I have a moment to actually go through your Twitter feed and it looks okay, I'll probably follow back. But if I don't have time, or if there's even a whiff that something's a little off, we're just not going to follow, because we don't want to encourage that. And so it's going to make growing our community in that space a little slower, but hopefully keep out the bad eggs. But also, because this person was tweeting at us, I assumed that they were a listener to the show at some point. So maybe they still are. And I want to comment on that directly, because if you listen to this show, you almost certainly think of yourself as a fan of science. So I can't believe I have to say this. Here we are. Don't harass women online. You are a dude and your feeling is, but I just want clarification, or I just want to know more. And it just so happens that the scientists that you often respond to with demands of that form or another are female. Just stop. Don't do it. And here's a clarification. Twitter is not the place for unsolicited peer review, period. No one owes you an explanation, and you are not entitled to a debate just because you happen to be on the same platform. Some actual advice I use in my life, and I know that other men I know use online, is if you read every single tweet or response you write before you send it out in the worst possible tone you can imagine, you will see the worst way you might come across, even if that's not your intention. So seriously, just try it. Instead of asking for the benefit of the doubt afterwards, take it away from yourself first and see how you sound. Because even if your intentions are good, you might be surprised by how easily your words can be turned against you if it is received by someone who just isn't in the mood for it at that moment. Now, it is more work to use the internet that way, but if you feel like you really are a good guy and can't figure out why people keep getting annoyed with you, just try it out for a little bit, rephrase things if you can to change the tone, or just delete the draft of the thing you were going to say and go for a walk. I promise you that every scientist on Twitter is aware of the criticisms of our work because we tell it to each other as a part of this process. We bicker with our colleagues about minutia you would not believe. And the little nagging voice in our head is very aware of every little thing we could have done better on every project. So we really, really don't need anyone to pile on. Just don't. This concludes the brief statement about our Twitter policy update. Thanks for listening.
Amen.
Ooh. Well said.
Thanks. Didn't want to have to do it, but, it's just, can't have it. Can't have it, people.
Yeah.
So with that out of the way, let's get back to the fun and let us come up with a patron thesis for our beloved patron, Julie S. So Julie has signed up to give us a little bit of money every month over on patreon.com/science-sort-of, a wonderful platform for supporting creators of all kinds, even web cartoonists.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.
So I don't have any additional information about Julie, so let's use what we talked about in this episode and see if we can't come up with a cool parasite volcanology-related fake thesis title for her BSso.
All right. Volcanoes and ice.
And parasites.
And parasites.
Wait, does it have to actually include both of those topics?
No, but that's sort of how we try to formulate these theses. Like what if, Kelly, what if there's a parasite that makes humans less afraid of volcanoes?
I'm trying to figure out how that would benefit the parasite.
Well, like toxoplasma in cats.
What if?
Because it's this isn't a real degree, Kelly.
But I'm a scientist. I can't, so
maybe there's
so the
a parasite.
feline attraction benefits Toxoplasma gondii.
What if there's a parasite that loves the cold and loves the nutrients that come out of an active volcano in the cold, but every time it erupts, it gets flushed out, and then it uses humans to get back to the ice?
I
put that into a title.
Do we try to do alliteration here too? I feel like that's a layer we've added.
Everything.
Well, we try to make it sound like a actual title to a scientific paper or thesis, sometimes with a pithy shorter phrase, colon, the long sciencey sounding thing that you actually would have made the title if you were just being technical, but you tried to have a little bit of fun.
Wait, I've got something, but you're still talking. Heat-seeking Haemosporidians have humans hunker down near heat. Something like that?
Yeah. Heat-seeking Haemosporidians driving human colonization of volcanically warmed soils.
You've dropped the alliteration thread, but if that's not important, that's fine with me.
Well, the whole thing doesn't need to be alliterative.
Okay. We're scientists, not lit majors.
Yeah, you got hung up on the alliteration, and I think it's hurting us.
But that's a good start, though. Heat-seeking Haemosporidians, blah blah, drive
What was the
human
word,
Kelly?
colonization
Haemosporidians.
They're parasites that live in blood.
subglacial
Okay.
volcanic environments.
All right.
Volcanically subglacial environments you can't really colonize. Not humans.
Heat-seeking Haemosporidians was sacrificing of virgins in volcanoes and anti-parasite defense.
It almost seems plausible.
Don't get hung up on that, Abe.
Volcanically ice caves. Okay, so I'm thinking heat-seeking Haemosporidians drive human colonization of volcanically.
Thermoregulated soil margins.
I was gonna say ice caves.
Ice caves? All right, cool.
Volcanically, I like the thermoregulated though.
Well, yeah, so thermally regulated ice volcanoes.
Yeah. Well, ice
Heat-seeking
caves and volcanoes.
Haemosporidians, parasitic drivers of human habitation of thermally regulated volcanic ice caves.
Perfect.
Done.
Boom.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.
Awesome.
You
Awesome
really got the
research topic.
all-stars for that
Yeah.
one.
I want to hear your results, Julie.
Fieldwork sounds fun.
Yeah, dangerous. Parasites and volcanoes.
Yeah,
Sometimes
the
dangerous
volcano
fun.
just kind of sits there.
Hmm.
If you're doing field work right.
I don't know. I keep hearing that we don't really have a way of predicting when they're going to go off. Kelly, do you have some feedback for us?
I do. Okay, so first I have a comment that I want to make. So
yes.
I recently gave a department seminar at the University of Central Florida, and I talked to Katie, Matt, Nicholas, and Veronica in the Savage Lab at UCF. And Matt Atkinson said that he listens to Science Sort of. So I just wanted to say,
Awesome.
hi, Matt. Thanks for listening. You made my day when you said that.
Awesome. Hey,
Yeah.
Matt.
Hey,
Yeah,
Matt.
Tuning in.
That was awesome.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you. And yeah, did you hear about what work the Savage Lab does?
Yeah. They study tumors on turtles, protozoan parasites in frogs that are poorly understood, terrestrial amphibians, plasticity, and anyway, they do lots of really awesome stuff.
Cool.
But that is not the PaleoPOW that I was supposed to address today. I just couldn't help myself. So to get to my task at hand, I am talking about an email today from Travis, the subject of which was Dinosaur Empire. And the body of the email read thus: Hey, I was unreasonably excited when my favorite scientist and favorite webcomicist, sorry, Zach, both appeared in a podcast together in episode 271. It was a great episode. I was a bit bummed out at Abby's self-deprecating humor. Sometimes I wasn't sure if it was humor. Abby, you're awesome. I just received the shipment confirmation of Dinosaur Empire Volume 1. I look forward to reading it with my 5-year-old. Keep up the great work, Travis. Travis, 1, I agree that Abby's awesome. And 2, you're awesome. I'm sure you and your 5-year-old are going to love Abby's book because me and my 4-year-old totally did. Thank you for your email.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Doesn't feel like that long ago, Kelly, but it was almost a year ago we had Abby on the show.
No, it was a year ago?
Because it was the eclipse, remember?
Oh my god.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
I forgot
right.
about the eclipse.
Time
Stop
flies when you're
depressing me.
having podcast.
Eclipses? Oh,
When you're having eclipses.
it did fly.
It was
All right,
flying
Abe.
through the sky. I saw a great tweet that was the tweet was just butterfly in the sky, initiate twice as high protocol. And LeVar Burton liked it, and it was a good moment for everyone involved on the internet. Okay.
No doubt.
Abe, what do you got for us, man?
I got one of my favorite types of reviews. A 5-star review.
From what platform?
Oh, good question. An iTunes review.
Yeah.
5-star iTunes review.
We like those.
We love those.
Somebody we know
because-
who left the review?
Yeah. It's by Dr. Carl Sagan.
What? He's
Yep.
alive and secretly leaving iTunes reviews?
Somewhat.
Amazing.
He may have wrote this from the after universe. The other side of the black hole. The other galaxy. Not really sure what's.
He put it on the golden disc of Voyager
Did
and
he
had it beamed back from the
Then-
Oort cloud.
Whoa. I like
Come
that
back, Carl.
theory the best.
Well, what did Carl have to say about our show?
So,
I'm very excited.
yeah,
Nervous. I mean, he's a preeminent, he's a preeminent scientist and science popularizer. So I
Well,
really
he-
hope he had a thoughtful and well-reasoned critique of what we're doing here.
Articulate.
Sort of. He did give us 5 stars, so that's already
All
a
right,
good
well, then
start.
who cares what he said?
So
I like this
Dr.
already.
Me too. So Dr. Carl Sagan says the title of his or her review, its review, is a whole episode about pterosaurs? Question mark, exclamation mark, question mark, exclamation mark.
You can just
Sort
say
of.
double interrobang.
Double the terabang.
No, double interrobang. Interrobang. Never. We don't have time. We don't have time. What's the review?
Double. You're just confusing me. Bang. And Dr. Carl Sagan says, sort of. Just enough science, nonsense, and tasty beverages so that I feel like I'm at the bar hanging with my geo colleagues. And so, pterosaurs, if you haven't tuned in to listen to episode 285, where Kevin and Ryan and Juliana sit down to talk about pterosaurs in the sky, then you should head on over to sciencesortof.com and have a listen to it. Because it was awesome, as evidenced by this 5-star review.
And if you think that Julie kind of drops off towards the end of that recording, it's not because we were excluding her. It's because she had played 2-3 roller derby bouts that weekend and fell asleep at the table.
Oh my gosh.
Don't judge her.
So
Still
we
got a
gotta
5-star review.
that we finished the podcast, but we didn't really keep asking her questions.
So, Dr. Carl Sagan, thank you very much for the 5-star review. We love it. It helps other potential listeners find their way to us. So, yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Keep tuning in.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for this week. Kelly, you got anything to plug? Anything going on?
Soonish has come out in additional languages. There's the Spanish language version in Spain, a Korean version in South Korea, the not crazy Korea, and it's also in Mandarin and some other languages.
Awesome.
I know, I'm really excited.
Where can I get the Spanish version?
I can send you one because it's only available. It's through Blackie Books in Spain, but I have a bunch of extra copies.
I would love that.
Abe, it's Spain Spanish. You wouldn't understand a word of it.
Oh, it's in
Well-
Portuguese also in Brazil.
Well, I have the English one, and I don't understand at least 3 words in it, so there's that.
It's in German too. Anyway, you're going to have to come to Charlottesville.
Can I pick
and
it up?
Yes. We'll go to 3 Notch Brewery, which is our local brewery, which is fantastic, and I will give you a copy of the book.
Awesome. Okay.
Awesome. And then
I'm
I'll
so
finally meet
excited.
Bev.
Yes.
And you, who I also have not met.
You can finally put a face to the voice. And
Yes,
I
exactly.
Oh,
yours.
that's hilarious.
Exactly.
Well, I cheated. I looked at a picture of you.
I followed you on Twitter, and although I can't really see much of your face on your Twitter account,
Ha.
you got me.
Was that the photo I put on your Twitter account, or have you changed it since I forced you to get a Twitter account, Abe?
I
No,
don't
you
know.
must have
What's
done
on
that one.
my
I wouldn't have
Twitter
used.
account?
I wouldn't have used that one. It's you in Antarctica with a parka.
Oh, yeah. What?
I love
Maybe I
that one
did.
with the mustache.
It's a mustache balaclava.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, so check out Soonish in your language of choice. And Abe, I'm assuming you don't have anything to plug, but I'll give you a chance. You got something?
Go forth in science.
There you go.
Woo.
Go forth in science.
Also, if you read anything about like volcanoes about to erupt in the internet or in your local newspaper, don't believe it. Just go and ask your nearest volcanologist or go to volcano.si.edu.
There you go. Yeah, plug a good resource for the word I'm looking for. The word where they make things blow out of proportion in terms of their danger.
Right? Overblown.
Overblown's a good one, especially for volcanoes, but it's not the word that I'm not remembering.
That's totally what I was thinking.
Questionable content. Let's leave it at that.
For non-overblown volcano content.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've discovered
Or-
I'm only ever clever by accident these days.
Also, it's people don't believe me, but it's much harder to be clever when the microphone light is on.
Yes.
Yes.
It does something to your brain. Can't explain it. We need to give that out as a patron thesis one of these days. that somebody studies the effect of knowing the microphone is turned on, making you stupid.
Or you can Twitter at any of us. And if we don't know the answer or we can't judge something thoroughly, we can refer you to better places of information that we know are reliable.
There you go.
Yeah.
Before now, but after this comes out, I will have done a webinar for AGU. I did a webinar for them previously, but this is my second one with Shane Hanlon, who is one of their Sharing Science folks who also does the Third Pod from the Sun AGU podcast, which is a great podcast name. Big fan of the name and the podcast. And we are going to be doing a webinar on science podcasting and talking to hopefully primarily scientists about what it takes to do a science podcast, but also something I've never talked about before, which Kelly got a little preview of from an email thread, how to be a good guest on a science podcast. So the webinar will have already happened, but they always record them and you can go back and rewatch them. So if you're interested in starting your own show or being a guest on other people's show and sounding your best, go check out that webinar.
Woo!
Yeah.
All right. Well, one last plug for Scott. Go check out his website, and hopefully we'll get him or some of the folks from his lab back on with future updates on that work because it sounds fascinating. The complexities of parasitism constantly perplex.
His lab is awesome.
Freaks.
And the people in his lab are awesome.
Parasite.
Still hate parasites, though.
You're wrong. You're wrong.
Those freaks of nature.
You're both wrong.
Well, this is Ryan Haupt being wrong, signing off for episode 292. Come back next time for episode 293. We'll be sure to give you a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Más o menos.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
You still there, Scott?
No. Oh, was he?
Okay, he left. Great.
Yeah. Great. Good.
Well, great was
Good
not what I
riddance.
meant.
We can talk about him again.
Phew.
You guys in town this weekend or heading out again?
We are heading to the western parts of Virginia because it is golly season, mother.
What's a golly?
The Golly is a river in West Virginia that is a dam-controlled whitewater river that only runs in the spring and fall.
Right. Are you going to go kayak, float, whitewater?
Raft. Whitewater rafting. Being like an 8-person inflatable raft. We're doing 2 days on the river, the upper river and the lower river. So
nice.